mute everybody and recording should be started. Kamlesh, please do it.
Okay, okay, I am doing it.
After seeing recording, Dubey sir will start.
So please mute everyone except.
तो दुबे सर अपने आप को अनम्यूट कर लीजिए.
Okay.
और David Moody can
yourself.
also unmute himself.
Okay.
Right, sir.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back with the Indore group once again. We have Dr. David Moody, who is going to talk to us about basically his 3 books, review of the 3 books written by him, why each one of these books were written, what was hoped to be accomplished, and what is unique about each of these books. So David is going to talk about this. As we have the custom, I'll briefly introduce Dr. David Moody, who hardly needs an introduction in the Krishnamurti circle. But anyway, I'll go ahead and let everybody, especially those who are new to this group, know about him. David's most recent book is The Krishnamurti in America, New Perspectives on the Man and His Message. This book represents a full-scale biography of Krishnamurti's life, with a special attention to the events in America that have not been covered well in previous biographies. In particular, Krishnamurti's relationship with Rajgopal, both personally and through the course of several lawsuits, is described in some detail. In addition, this biography follows closely the evolution and development of Krishnamurti's philosophy, decade by decade, from the 30s until his death in 1986. This research enables Moody to present Krishnamurti's philosophy in a new and more accurate light, one that emphasizes the psychological elements of his teaching. And David Moody's previous book was an uncommon collaboration, David Bohm and J. Krishnamurti, which was published in 2017. This book reviews the entire course of the career of theoretical physicist Dr. David Bohm, with extensive and detailed attention to his interactions and relationship with Krishnaji. The publication of this book led to Moody's participation as one of the interviewees in the recent biographical film about Bohm, Infinite Potential. And Dr. David Moody's first book, The Unconditioned Mind, J. Krishnamurti and the Oak Grove School, which was published in 2011. In this book, he describes the issues and individuals who were most instrumental in the early growth and development of Oak Grove School, with special attention to Krishnaji's actions and involvement. David Moody was the first teacher to be hired when Krishnaji started the Oak Grove School in California in 1975. He subsequently served as educational director of the school and finally its director, the position he held at the time of Krishnaji's death in 1986. Mr. David Moody later took his PhD in science education from University of California at Los Angeles in 1991, with a focus on student misconceptions in the study of biological evolution. With these words, I'll request Dr. David Moody to please start his talk. And once again, I want to express my gratitude and thanks to you for accepting our offer to be with us today and enlighten us with your talk. Dr. David Moody, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And thank you all for joining me. It's evening here in Ojai, California. And before I get started, I just wanted to say a special hello to Harsh Tonka, who I haven't seen in many, many years. And it's quite something to suddenly say hello to him again after all this time in this strange forum of Zoom. So I'm going to try to explain kind of the background for the books that I wrote. And to do that, I have to explain about Oak Grove School. And I'm not sure how much many of you understand about the Oak Grove School, the origin of it, and what took place here. So I'm going to explain some of the background, and if it's material that is already very familiar to you, I'm sorry, but I feel like I have to bring kind of everybody up to date. So I'll speak to those of you who might know the least and beg for the patience of those of you for whom this material is already familiar. So to understand Oak Grove School, the school opened in 1975, but to understand the school really, you have to go all the way back to 1922, which is when Christian G first came to the Ojai Valley. Ojai is a little valley in Southern California. It's about 80 miles north of Los Angeles and a little bit inland from the ocean. And Christian G came here in 1922 with his brother Nitya, and the purpose of their visit was to try to find a place that would be healing and beneficial for the tuberculosis that Nitya had been suffering from for over a year at that time. They had actually been in Australia, and they thought their destination was Switzerland. They were going to go to Switzerland because it supposedly had a healing climate for Nitya's tuberculosis. But someone had told them that there was a valley in Southern California where there was a property owned by some people in the Theosophical Society. And this valley was supposed to have a healing benefit for people suffering from tuberculosis. So instead of traveling directly from Australia to Switzerland, they thought they would come the long way around and stop in California in this valley. So they came in 1922, and probably many of you realize that Christian G and Nitya both were kind of entranced with the valley. They were very much struck by the beauty of it and the special quality that they felt here. So instead of making it just a stepping stone on their way to Switzerland, they settled in, and Krishnamurti essentially made it his home, more or less, for the rest of his life. Of course, he traveled around the world most years, but to the extent that he had a home, Ojai was perhaps as close as he came to having a particular place that was kind of an anchor for him. So Annie Besant came out to Ojai to visit Krishnamurti in 1927. And when she came here, she saw that this would be a place, an important place for his life's work. And she purchased several properties in the Ojai Valley and near the Ojai Valley for Christian G's life's work. And part of the intention for this was that he should start a school one day in Ojai. So it was a long time before that dream was really realized. The first effort that Christian G made to start a school was in 1946, when they started what was called the Happy Valley School, not exactly in Ojai, but just adjacent to Ojai. But that school still exists. It's called the Besant Hill School now. But Christian G's association with that school only lasted for about 10 years, and it seems like he was never really strongly involved in that school. So when the Oak Grove School opened in 1975, it was the fulfillment of a dream and intention that had its roots many, many years in the past. And the way the school came about is also important to understand, because as many of you probably know, Christian G's work, traveling around and having his talks and things published, most of the business side of his work was handled by Rajagopal, who was with Christian G for many years, all the way back to the 1920s. But by the time of the 1950s and 1960s, that relationship pretty much fell apart. And the reasons for that to the extent that we can understand it, is one of the reasons why I wrote my most recent book, Krishnamurti in America, to explain the course of that relationship and why it seemed very strong in the earlier decades and then pretty much fell apart by the late 1950s, early 1960s. And part of the difficulty was that Rajagopal wouldn't let Krishnamurti take any role of responsibility in the administration of his work. And also there were questions about whether or not Rajagopal was really handling the money donated on behalf of Krishnamurti's work, whether he was handling it properly. And there are a lot of issues that were just very unclear and unsettled. And so finally in 1968, Krishnamurti broke off relations with Rajagopal completely. And the organization that Rajagopal had created called Krishnamurti Writing Incorporated. So in 1968 in Sanan, Krishnamurti announced his complete separation from Krishnamurti Writing Incorporated and basically from Rajagopal. And right about that time, a married couple named Erna Lilliefelt and Theo Lilliefelt moved to Ojai because they were very interested in Krishnamurti's work and they wanted to be near where he lived. But they were very disturbed to find out that Krishnamurti had separated from Rajagopal, and his whole future involvement in the Ojai Valley, which he had made kind of a home for so many years, was now threatened. The property in the east end of the valley where Krishnamurti had lived with his own kind of home called Pine Cottage, that property was no longer available to him. And other properties in the valley, his access to them were very unclear. And Erna Lilliefelt was a very powerful woman. She had a background in business. She was extremely astute with respect to organizational management and legal issues. And she was very disturbed by the implications of Krishnamurti's separation from Rajagopal and what that would mean for all the property that had been donated on behalf of Krishnamurti, which was now no longer under his control. So she began a series of investigations into all of the basically property transactions that Rajagopal had conducted for many years. And she felt as though she had uncovered a lot of evidence of malfeasance, legal malfeasance in the administration of the funds and the properties. And she brought this to Krishnamurti's attention within a couple of months of the time that he separated from Rajagopal in 1968. And Krishnamurti was very, very impressed with the evidence that Erna Lilliefelt presented to him. And he was so impressed that he put Erna and her husband Theo pretty much in charge of a new organization that would be responsible for administering his work in the United States. That was the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. That was formed just about 8 months after, in early 1969, about 8 months after he had separated from Quink, Krishnamurti Writings and Rajagopal. So the Krishnamurti Foundation of America, its main purpose was just to, arrange Krishnamurti's talks and look after the publication of his works and just, manage his the kind of the business side of his teaching. But although that was its main purpose, that there was kind of a derivative or supplementary purpose, which was to regain control of all of the financial and property and intellectual property that was still under the control of Rajagopal, because Rajagopal kept control over millions of dollars in funds, many, many acres of property, and all of the intellectual property that he had accumulated for decades pertaining to Krishnamurti's work. So Erna and the Krishnamurti Foundation of America initiated a series of negotiations trying to recover all of these assets from Rajagopal. And after 2 or 3 years of fruitless negotiations, they finally entered into a lawsuit to recover all of these assets. That was in 1971. And that lawsuit was enormously complicated. There was a great deal of property involved, a lot of lawyers involved, a lot of thorny legal issues involved, tremendous quantity of, motions filed and briefs and memoranda. And Erna Liliefeld was in charge of managing all of this. And finally, at the end of 3 years of legal back and forth in 1974, she won for the Krishnamurti Foundation really a huge victory for Krishnamurti and recovered hundreds of acres of property, millions of dollars that had been donated in funds, and most importantly, all of the intellectual property, all of the manuscripts and letters that had been part of Krishnamurti's work for decades. So this happened in 1974, and it was the recovery of the property in that lawsuit that enabled Krishnamurti to start the Oak Grove School. On property that was right in the middle of the Ojai Valley and that had been purchased for that purpose by Annie Besant all the way back in 1927. So when the Oak Grove School started in 1975, it was the fulfillment of a dream that had very, very deep roots. And yet it was born as a consequence of this lawsuit that had gone on for a number of years, which was obviously, it was a very contentious thing. And that lawsuit probably would never have been initiated and probably would not have been won had it not been for Erna Liliefeld. She was a worthy warrior for that kind of a cause. She very much believed in what she was doing and worked very, very diligently for many years to bring this about. But there was an irony in all of this, which is that, as soon as all of this property was recovered for Krishnamurti's work, the first thing he wanted to do was start a school. And when Erna got involved starting the Krishnamurti Foundation, she didn't have in mind a school at all. She had in mind, recovering what had been unjustly taken from Krishnamurti. And she was a good warrior to go to battle legally with Rajagopal. But starting a school for elementary and secondary school students was not at all what she had in mind. But of course, if that's what Krishnamurti wanted, she was willing to go along, but she was perhaps kind of a reluctant participant, maybe from the very beginning. And so there was an irony in the very, very outset of the school, which was that Erna and her husband Teo, who were in charge of the Krishnamurti Foundation, were not ideally suited to be trustees of an elementary and secondary school. So from 1975, when the school opened, until Krishnaji died in 1986, there was a lot of turbulence in the school. There was a series of, I don't quite want to use the word revolution, but a kind of upheaval in the school on several occasions. And Erna was involved to some extent. She made a number of moves which were very controversial and resulted in a lot of difficulty in the school. Just to give you one aspect of what was difficult about the school, the Oak Grove is a day school. That means that, the children live at home, and the families send their children to school in the day, and then the students go back. So it's not like a boarding school that you see at Brockwood Park or some of the schools in India. And part of what this means is that a lot of the families that enrolled their children in Oak Grove School, they moved to Ojai just for that purpose. They weren't families that already lived in Ojai. They were people who knew about Krishnamurti's work and heard he was starting a school here, and they were so dedicated to their children and to having their children enrolled in a Krishnamurti school that they picked up from wherever they were living, Los Angeles or Seattle or wherever, and moved to this little town of Ojai just to put their kids in the school. So what that meant was that not only was Krishnamurti involved in starting the school, but all these parents were moving here who were very dedicated and had very strong feelings about their children's education and about Krishnamurti. And they wanted very much to be involved. And Erna's attitude was that the school was, for one thing, she was upset because the school was a big drain on the finances of the Krishnamurti Foundation, which was a major concern of hers. And also she didn't have a good relationship with the teachers. She didn't really trust them very much. And so she had a tendency to want to put parents in charge of the school. And this created all kinds of additional conflicts. So the bottom line is that from 1975, when the school opened, until 1986, when Krishnji died, there was a great deal of conflict and turbulence in the school. And I was kind of centrally involved in all of that because I was the first teacher hired by Mark Lee when the school opened. And as a consequence of the first upheaval, he and I became co-directors of the school. And then as a consequence of another upheaval, he had to leave his position and I was appointed director of the school. But my position was not at all secure either because there was so much tension among the trustees and the teachers and me that I was not able to stay in that position either for more than 2 or 3 years. And all of this is interesting, I think, from the perspective of understanding Krishnamurti, because he he came to Ojai every year for 3 months. And during that time, he had a lot of things to consider. There were continuing lawsuits with Rajagopal. The one that terminated in 74 was just the first of several lawsuits. So he had that on his mind. He had public talks to give. He had all kinds of things to do. And, he would have preferred, I'm sure, that the Oak Grove School be running smoothly. And he would give talks to the teachers. And all would be well, but it wasn't like that. The turbulence in the schools was so great that he had to get directly involved himself. And as a witness to all of that, after I left the school in 1988, I felt like I had a responsibility to record what I had observed. I felt like I was a witness to something rather extraordinary and unusual and interesting. And I felt like I had an obligation because I'd seen so much of what took place, and especially Krishnji's role in it. I felt like I had an obligation to write that down, to write a book for posterity or what have you. But that book was not easy to write. It was not, I knew as soon as I left the school in 1988 that I needed to do this. And I even started trying to do it right away, but it was not clear to me how to go about it. The whole experience of being in the school was there's a great deal of turbulence and a lot of things which happened which confusing to me. And it was very difficult for me to get a handle on what it was that I really wanted to convey. So my book about the school did not come out until 2011. It took all that time for me to kind of sort through everything I'd been through and the meaning of it and to figure out how I wanted to present the material. And finally, the way I was finally able to write the book is I thought, well, what is really important about what happened, what I witnessed, was just, what Krishnaji did, what his actual actions were vis-a-vis the school, and why he acted the way he did. So that was kind of the thread on which I described everything that took place. But in order to understand what Krishnaji did, you had to understand the context in which he was functioning, which means you had to understand the other personalities that were involved and why there was so much tension and conflict and the nature of the conflicts. So describing all of that context had to take up a great deal of the book. But the point of the book really was to show how Krishnamurti interacted with all of that. I felt it was an important thing, as I say, for history to record, how his philosophy of life, in a sense, interacted with how he actually behaved in the context of the school. So as I say, it took until 2011 for me to finally publish that book, to write it, to figure out how I wanted to approach it and get it published. And when I did that, I felt that I had relieved myself of a great responsibility. And I thought, well, I'm free now. I can do whatever I want. But in the meantime, something else had taken place, and that has to do with David Bohm. I was fortunate, after Krishnaji died, David Bohm came to Ojai every year from 1986 until 1990. He came and spent 6 weeks here in Ojai every year, and he conducted seminars. They took place at Oak Grove School, and these were for the purpose of conveying his understanding of the psychological field. And his understanding, of course, was very much influenced by his work with Krishnamurti, but there were also a lot of original elements that he brought in, and he expressed it all in his own very unique and colorful way with his own language and examples and metaphors. And so he conducted a series of seminars, 1986, 87, 88, 89, 90. And during those years, I was enrolled at UCLA doing graduate work. So I didn't have a fixed schedule. So during the weeks that Bohm was here, I was able to spend a lot of time with him. I would go up to his apartment most afternoons and walk with him and talk for an hour or two. So I had a lot of exposure to Bohm and his point of view. And after I finished my first book, The Unconditioned Mind, about Oak Grove School, I was concerned about the way Bohm's relationship with Krishnaji had been portrayed, because there was one biography of Bohm that had been written by his friend and collaborator, David Peat. That book was called Infinite Potential. And David Peat was not really a big fan of Krishnamurti, and he wasn't particularly enamored of Bohm's relationship with Krishnamurti. And so the way he conveyed their relationship and the work that they did together was really kind of pejorative in a way that was sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle. And as someone who had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with both Krishnamurti and Bohm, I felt like I had a possibility of maybe setting the record straight a little bit. And so that was one of the reasons why I wrote my second book, An Uncommon Collaboration, in order to present the whole nature of their relationship in a more accurate light. And so then when I finished that book, and had it published, which was 2017, once again, I thought, well, I've completed my responsibilities and now I'm free. I can do what I like. But once again, it wasn't quite that simple. And part of the reason, once again, it has to do with another book which had been written, which I felt distorted events rather badly. And that was a book that was written by the daughter of Rajagopal. Her name was Radha Rajagopal. Her married name was Radha Sloss. And she wrote a book called Lives in the Shadow, which described her mother's relationship with Krishnamurti and described all of the conflicts that developed with Rajagopal and Krishnamurti. And again, she wrote in a way which I felt was very, very one-sided and damaging to Krishnaji's reputation, certainly in the United States and maybe elsewhere as well. And then in addition, Mary Zimbalist's memoirs were starting to be published, and these shed a lot of additional light on Krishnaji's activities, which had not been covered in any of the previous biographies by Mary Lutyens or Pupul Jayakar. So I felt there was a need again to write the story of Krishnaji's life in America, which had never really been fully told properly. Mary Lutyens didn't include a lot of the events which had transpired here in a very thorough way. Pupul Jayakar's amazing biography really doesn't cover the time in America very much. So in order to correct the record that had been presented by Rajagopal's daughter, Radha Sloss, and also to incorporate a lot of new material, such as what had been published by Mary Zimbalist, I wrote my most recent book, Krishnamurti in America, which is really, it's a full-scale biography. The title is Krishnamurti in America, and it does emphasize his life in America because that's the part which has been missing from previous biographies. But it's a full-scale biography. It tells the whole story of his life so that the portions in America make sense because it's part of a larger context, of course. So that's kind of it. Those are the three books that I wrote. The Krishnamurti in America came out almost exactly a year ago. And that's pretty much the basic subject matter of those books and the reasons, the motivations I had in writing them. Perhaps I should just say one other thing, and that is that, it's my opinion that in the world generally and in the United States in particular, Krishnamurti's work is tremendously underappreciated. And it may not be so bad in India or some other parts of the world, but in the United States especially, he's almost a forgotten figure. When I wrote Krishnamurti in America, I had I wanted the book to be published by a proper publisher and have all the publicity and kind of muscle behind it that a good publisher could bring. And I found a good book agent, an agent in New York who had a lot of connections. And I thought that she would be able to place the book with a major publisher without too much difficulty. But all the major publishers turned up their noses at it. They said, no, they said, we can't afford to take a risk on a book about Krishnamurti because nobody's interested in him anymore. Even publisher Harper and Row, who published Pupul Jayakar's biography and who published a lot of Krishnamurti's own works, they said the same thing. They said, Krishnamurti was, we could publish his work in the 1980s and 1990s, but the interest in his work has fallen off so much that we just can't take a risk on publishing a book about him because nobody knows about him or cares anymore. So part of the reason why I wrote these books is to try to present his work in a way which would make it more accessible to people. In the United States especially, Krishnamurti, first of all, almost nobody knows anything about him. And the people who, if you just say his name, Krishnamurti, and say, well, he's an Indian teacher or Indian philosopher, people get an image, you know, of a mystic or a guru of some kind. And most people just dismiss that kind of thing. They have no interest in it and don't want to look further. And so one of the principal themes of the biography I wrote, Krishnamurti in America, is to try to present Krishnamurti's work in another light so that people can understand that he's not just a mystic or engaged in some kind of speculative spirituality, but that really the center of gravity of his work is psychological and is a very detailed and concrete and comprehensive exposition of human psychology. I don't think that basic fact is appreciated by most people. So that was another reason why I wanted to write Krishnamurti in America, and that's one of the major themes of that book, even though it's a biography and it focuses, on his life events and the people in his life. You cannot really separate the man and the teaching. So a big part of that book also just focuses on the teachings per se, how they evolved over the course of decades, and then again, putting it in a perspective where it's understood as, an exposition of human psychology with, perhaps a religious or spiritual foundation, but the main thrust of the teachings I propose is in the psychological field and has to be understood in that light. And I did that partly with the hope and expectation that this would possibly facilitate interest and access to his work for many people, because as I say, his work is badly underappreciated, especially in this country. So that's kind of it. And I didn't want to go on for too long because, as I said at the beginning, I don't really have a very good sense of who you all are or what your background is. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for people to put questions instead of me just kind of guessing what you might not know or what you might want to hear about. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say, and I'm open to. I don't know how we're going to handle the logistically the asking of questions, but I'll leave that up to somebody else. That's as far as I can take it.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot. It's more or less sums up what you have written in the 3 books. I have some questions in the chat box, but before we go there, I request Dr. Gajanan Rao, Mr. Harsh Tankha, Professor Krishna, and Mr. Harshad Parekh in the same order to make some observations or say something, and then we go to the questions. Dr. Gajanan Rao, please unmute yourself, sir. Unmute. Yes.
That I haven't much to say about what David G was talking, because I'm glad anyway he brought a lot of history into it. It must be very genuine because of his own observation of things that happened there. Well, it's all news to me because I never went into the background history of Krishnamurti so much as I would struggle with his teachings to understand. So I would rather think Krishna would be a proper person, or Harsh, or somebody like that, who have been well versed with all this, who written books in Krishna, like Krishna, would say something more than I will maybe, but then again.
Harshji, please go
ahead. It was fantastic. I would say it was very interesting to listen to David Moody, because first time I'm seeing him and it was like a conversation with us, sharing the most, if not very intimate associations of Krishnamurti and Bom, and that used to really a wonder to me as to how they got on, and the events that took place in the school, and how school was very near Krishnaji's heart. But I have always this, doubt and anxiety when I run a school with some associates of who were interested in Krishnamurti. But I don't know if you're doing a very right thing very often. And it does pain me when teachers don't really focus so much on students as David was saying. And, that's important, how the children grow, how they become whole, not remain unintegrated within themselves and cause a lot of problems to society. That's our main focus on children as they grow in our schools. I don't know if there are hints thrown. Why hints thrown? There must be a lot of things done by you to Vijay, to see that they grow rightly. They're nurtured rightly by the teachers. It's not easy to get teachers to do that because they haven't even known what Krishna is talking. And they have to come here and learn. Whether they really go to the senior teachers, as Krishnamurti would ask, find out what is this school is all about. How has it to perform rightly so that children benefit or come from far away? All these are important questions, and our focus is mainly that. The culture they bring about tomorrow, the character they build within themselves and distribute without much of talking to so many others. We see a bit of it really. I'm not saying we're not. We have done our work maybe, but I still feel there's a lot more to do with what Moody was saying. I think we should get much more concerned. Thank you, sir, for that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Harshji, if you want to say something, sir.
Yes. First, let me say, David, it's so wonderful to hear you speak concisely and clearly. And it's a pity that we haven't actually kept up with each other since our interests run so much parallel, including science teaching and misconception in science and all of that. We've discussed that at times too. But for the moment, I'd like to bring up a couple of things which I think are relevant even today concerning what you've been saying. Of course, when all the troubles and tribulations in Ojai, we at Brockwood virtually had a daily update. And so I know exactly what happened during that time. And I thought that it was a terrible pity that you do not continue as the director of Ojai, because I think it needed a person like you. But just to tell everybody, there was kind of, the parents around were all very involved. And we at Brockwood were discussing how, observing this, we're discussing how much parents should be involved in a school. And I think particularly in America and particularly in California, parents like to be hands-on, and it's a kind of idea of democracy.
Yeah.
That the will of the people, that they should decide collectively what it should be like. And but Krishnaji was very clear about something when discussing this. He said, no, the right thing has to happen. And it is not always so that the collective group fastens on the right thing to do. In fact, it's almost always never so that it is. And that if whenever significant change has come about in the world, it has always started with a small group of people. It's not the collective mass that brings about a change in the world. It's always a small group of people who see what is the right thing to do. In fact, he went so far as to say, if one person, and this he impressed on all of us, if one person sees the right thing to do, it becomes their responsibility to see that that is done. So this ran very counter to the ideas of democracy, inclusion, participation which also must happen. And but the balance between this and the role of the parents. So we were discussing this as a very live question because we had similar questions at Brockwood. Of course, fortunately, the parents were not on hand all the time to bother us, right? So we didn't get that kind of pressure from them.
Yeah.
But it raises this interesting question, which I've always had, and which we're actually seeing the rise of today in some populism. Is something that is popular, something that is believed by lots of people, the right thing. And the world is increasingly beginning to be a place where what the masses say should happen is what is focused on. And the necessity for some individuals to hold a line which they are seeing as correct. Now that's very difficult because how do you know that you're seeing the right thing? That's very challenging. And I think Krishnaji's teachings goes to the heart of what it is. And we've been discussing this here too. How do you know you're not deluding yourself? How do you know that you're seeing the right thing? That is a very important factor in what he wanted to see happen. So, I mean, these are the issues that all the turmoil in Oak Grove was throwing up for us at Brockwood, and we were sort of learning from it. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was about Rajgopal's influence on Krishnamurti. Now, you know that I produced the collected works of Krishnamurti on a CD-ROM. You must have used the CD-ROM yourself. And when I was making the collective works, I spoke to Krishnamurti about this because there was some question about what should be considered really part of Krishnamurti's teachings. What about the earliest work? What about what he said when he was in the part of the Theosophical Society? Should that be considered his work? So I asked him that question because I wanted to know what I should include in the collected works. So some things became quite clear in discussion with him. He said that certainly when he was in the early days, his vision was always clear. He always saw the same thing. The depth of that part he was seeing, but the way that he expressed himself and the way that it came out changed. And at the beginning, he was using terminology and images which he had received, as it were, from the Theosophists. And so he was using that imagery to try and illustrate what he was talking about. It's not that he changed his view, it's just that the way he was describing it. So that was one aspect, that in that sense, it could be easily adopted and co-opted by the Theosophists as their own. And he didn't want that to happen. So then as time went on, when he did make a break with the Theosophists and he was his own voice, and this is where Rajgopal comes in, the original, when he spoke, what he said was transcribed. Well, what he transcribed was edited by Rajgopal.
I don't know.
Yes, and he made changes, which actually Krishnaji did not like. They did not feel that they conveyed, because what he is trying to convey is subtle, and you can easily twist it slightly by changing the word. It's very interesting how that happens. So when I asked him about those, he said those, he used the word patchy. He said they were still what he wanted to say, but not completely so. They were true in patches. So I said, should I include the earlier things edited by him? He said, no. So at the feet of the masters and the flight of the eagle, they were not to be considered as part of his work. And he said, it's only when in 1933 that he started speaking again. And then they started to produce the verbatim reports. And then he started editing it himself. And the interesting thing about the verbatim reports is that very often the so-called verbatim reports are not verbatim reports. They have been edited by Krishnaji, who has added things which he never said during the talk. But, but he has the right, he had the right to do so, right?
Of course.
So they're not strictly verbatim reports, but they're definitely Krishnamurti's teachings.
Right.
So this, I think, might be of interest to everybody, that there, he did want to make a definite line. Say, he did not want to confuse people, and he wanted people, he wanted his words to be his words completely.
Yeah.
That was, and that was also part of his repudiation and his breakup with Rajgopal, because it wasn't just the finances that he was trying to control, it was even the message that because you know, and I don't know if everybody knows, but originally the Theosophists were not sure whether it was going to be Rajgopal or Krishnamurti who was going to be the world teacher, as they called it. So eventually they chose Krishnamurti. And there has always been a certain kind of feeling, which I, talking to people, that this was, of course, something that Rajgopal didn't like, in that he felt maybe that he was really the person who should be there. So that friction between them always existed as well. So I think, but for today, for us, it's good to recognize that there is a point from which Krishnamurti is his own person, and it is his own teachings, and away from the influence of Rajgopal.
Yes.
So I mean, I can talk a lot. Also, I knew David Bohm extremely well, because every time that he came to Brockwood, which he did every week, talk to Krishnamurti, I also spoke to him on his own, sometimes with 2 or 3 people, some of whom you know, we were a small group, Joe Zorski, and you probably know Ted Carty, right? Because they were, right. So 3 or 4 of us would discuss outside. He had discussions with Krishnamurti, he had discussions with the staff, and then he had, then 3 or 4 of us talked to him as well. And I knew his family well, and we spoke about personal things as well. So we have spoke about his relationship with Krishnamurti as well. And so it's something that I would love to talk with you about, since you're also, and of course, the whole development of Bohm's idea of dialogue. We had many, many hundreds of dialogues about dialogue with Bohm. So I would love to connect, sometimes, and I'm sure there is a lot still to be said about some of these things.
A great deal.
Yeah. Especially, I think, the form of dialogue that these days is called Bohmian dialogue, that some people is not really true to his principles of dialogue. But there is that, I don't know how much to say in this group about that. But so I think I'll leave it at that. I think the most important things is this question of the teachings, or where do the teachings begin? But I would say this thing about it. Yes.
Thank you, Harjeet, for bringing out a different perspective. David, would you like to say something, or we go to Professor Krishna now?
No, let's go. I don't have anything particularly to add. I thought everything that Harsh said was quite fascinating, but I'm looking forward to hear what Dr. Krishna has to say.
Okay, so Professor Krishna, sir.
Yeah, I have read all the books that David Moody has written. And I have always felt very grateful to him for having written them, because I think they give first-hand accounts of his own experience and involvement with the teaching and with the man. And that is very precious. Also, they fill several gaps which were left out in other biographies. And so for the sake of complete understanding of Krishnamurti, the man, and his efforts to communicate his teaching, I think it has been very useful to have these books written by David. Of course, I have known David personally for several years, and we have had several dialogues about the teachings in Ohio and also in Canada and so on. So I know him both personally and through his books. What specially I learned was that in India, Krishnaji was not involving himself much with the parents in the schools. He was only addressing the children and the staff, the teachers, partly because their parents were too numerous. The schools in India are all rather big. He wanted smaller schools. And that was his aim in starting at Brockwood, a residential school, where in general, in residential schools, you can't involve much with parents because they are all far away. But in a day school like the Oak Grove School, it was possible. And he was interested in that. He did address many parents and involve them himself, because he felt that the parents are the first teachers of, and the environment at the home has also to be conducive to the teachings. And I think that's something novel, and it is brought out in David's books very clearly, which is not so in the books in India, because he never involved himself with the parents, not much. In the public, parents might have come also, but that's different. This was about education directly. And also the school in the Wolf Lake School in Canada was also started with those ideals. And he tried there to involve the parents and talk to the parents. Some of those talks, 3 talks which he gave there, are some of the most beautiful expressions of his vision of education. So anyone who hasn't seen them, suggest that you can find the video and read it, because that's a very good summary of Krishnamurti's vision of education or approach to education. Yeah, basically that's what I wanted to say. And also thank David Moody, both for his books and for his narration today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Harshad Bhai, would you like to make some comments?
Yes. David Moody had come to Rishi Valley in 1985, and there was an education conference, and I was very much impressed by the passion David Moody had to create a new brain in the school. But on the other hand, Indian educators in the conference, they were more interested in curriculum and teaching methods. So I was not very much impressed, but I was very much impressed by David Moody's passion to create a new brain, and very much passionate about Krishnamurti's teachings. And another thing which I like to say, that the best books of Krishnamurti, I find they are commentaries on living, because the dialogues there are with people of many different backgrounds, and they are um, very short, but they had tremendous depth and lot of beauty, which I did not find that kind of beauty in the dialogue with David Bohm and Krishnamurti, I found that the dialogues with David Bohm and Krishnamurti, I found they are more very serious and very philosophical. And the other thing I like to say that there are many groups who are interested in Krishnamurti on Facebook, and many of them they are discussing about Krishnamurti. So I do not think that there is not much interest in Krishnamurti now. The interest is growing, I feel. And the last thing I like to say is about the papers which Raja Gopal gave to Huntington Library. Are these available, and has anybody gone into that paper and has done any research to say something about life of Krishnamurti? That is all.
David, you want to say something on this? Yeah.
Yeah, I can answer a little bit about the Huntington Library. Yes, it's true that Rajagopal donated a huge quantity of material to the Huntington Library. This was part of what was at issue, part of what was being disputed in the various lawsuits between KFA and Rajagopal and Quink. The KFA was trying to recover all of this material, which is, basically what you would put in the category of intellectual property, manuscripts and letters and just all kinds of things that he had accumulated for many years. And Rajagopal declared that all of this material belonged to him personally, and therefore he refused to turn it over to the KFA, and this was one of the reasons why the lawsuits were so extensive and went on and on. He declared he called all this material the Rajagopal Historical Collection, and after he donated it to the Huntington Library, Erna Liliefeld went down to the library, which is in Pasadena. It's not, it's a 1 or 2 hours drive from Ojai. And she made an inventory of all of this material. And the inventory, just the inventory listing the material, goes on for more than 100 pages. There's such a vast quantity of it. Now, as for the disposition of that material and whether or not it's available, Huntington Library, in principle is open. It exists for the purpose of serious scholars to come and do research. So anybody who can, present a case that they are a serious scholar, I think has access to that material. And I might be mistaken, but I think that the KFA went to considerable lengths to try to make copies of all that material so that it would be, so they would at least have copies in the archives that the KFA maintains in Ojai. I'm not certain of that, but it shouldn't be too hard to find out if the KFA also has copies of all that material.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I have lots of questions in the chat box. So I'll start with 1 or 2 and then people can ask questions themselves. There's one from Mr. M. Prasanna. His audio is not functioning. So I'll read his question to you, David. Given your long association with Krishnaji, could you distill his philosophy into its easily digestible basic tenets?
Okay, well, let me just say, no, I can't possibly, but let me just talk kind of around that issue a little bit, and that will have to substitute. One point is that, Krishnji, one of the reasons why I kind of hesitate to do this, Krishnji was very definite that he said he did not want any interpreters. He didn't want anybody coming along after him to interpret what he was saying. And I think he had in mind, the vision of a priest in a church, telling you the true meaning of the philosophy of the church. He didn't want anybody to come along and represent themselves as an authority speaking on his behalf. He wanted the teachings to speak for themselves. My feeling is that Christian Shi's admonition in that regard is a little bit unfortunate, because I think it has kind of inhibited people from talking about the teachings, about the substance, for fear that they'll, fall into the trap of interpreting. So part of what I've tried to do in my work is to get out of that trap and go ahead and discuss the teachings, even at the risk of someone going along and saying, "Oh, you're interpreting." So let me just say a couple of quick things about the substance of Christian G's work. There are two things that might not be obvious to people that I think are really fundamental to his work. One has to do with conflict. I think a lot of Christian G's work can be understood with reference to conflict. A great deal of what he had to say has to do with finding a state of mind that is not, intrinsically or inwardly conflicted. If you look at his teachings, the question of not being in conflict is a kind of a thread that runs through all kinds of different issues and kind of ties them together in a way that may not be obvious. And another very, very basic element of Christian G's work has to do with the issue of time. Time is something that, normally we all take for granted. It's just kind of the part of the fabric of the background of life. But Christian G does something very interesting in his teachings. He says that he refers to another kind of time, which he calls psychological time. And that's a distinction we don't normally make. We just think, well, there's just time, it's chronological time, which we measure by the calendar and the clock, and it is what it is. And Christian G says, yes, there is that kind of time, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly valid, and it's something that, we all make use of and live with. But Christian G says there's another kind of time which you think is chronological time, but it's really not. It's what he calls psychological time. And so and when he says psychological time, he doesn't just mean something like my subjective experience of time, which is that's a concept or a construct which is fairly familiar. People talk about their subjective experience of time, like when you're waiting for a dentist appointment, time seems to go very slowly, or if you're having a good time, time seems to go quickly. That's what we call subjective experience of time. But when Christian G talks about psychological time, he doesn't mean that. He means something entirely different, which is a distinction that most of us don't observe, but Christian G says it's absolutely fundamental, that psychological time is, it's the kind of time in which I'm going to improve myself. It's the kind of time in which I'm going to achieve wisdom or courage or whatever it is that I feel like I personally want to become. And Christian G says that that kind of time is fundamentally different than chronological time, although we don't normally recognize that distinction. And he says that psychological time is basically illusory, and it's one of the great sources of our confusion and misunderstandings about life.
Thank you, David. Thanks a lot. We have questions from VK. VK, would you please ask your question?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Mr. David, this is for you. So you have had an experience with Krishna ji, and you talked about your own memories and uncommon collaboration. I would like to know, in your interaction with Krishnamurti and David Bohm, did you find anything essentially different about the essence of life, man, living?
I'm not sure I got the question. Is the question whether there was a difference in the quality of life between Krishnamurti and Bohm? I didn't quite get the question.
Sir, how Krishnamurti was taking forward the essence of life, and David Bohm himself. Was there any difference, or they were both converging to the same?
I think there was quite a bit of difference in the essential way that the two men lived. You know, Krishnaji lived the teachings totally, and you know, I referred a minute ago to the significance of the issue of conflict, and how, you know, a great deal of the teachings has to do with finding a way of life that is not conflicted, in which, you know, inwardly within ourselves we don't have one part of ourselves in battle with another. And I think that, you know, what Krishnji said is that the trouble with conflict, it's not as though, you know, there's anything morally wrong with it or you're a bad person if you have conflict. It was just that it's inefficient. Where you have conflict, it's inefficient. You have a wastage of energy. And Krishnji said that if you have a way of living without conflict, you can gather all your energy to, you know, penetrate deeply into oneself or into truth. And I think that's the way Krishnji lived. And that's why he was such a powerful presence, for example, when giving his public talks, because he lived without conflict, which meant that he had all of his energy available to work harmoniously in doing what he wanted to do. And that's a very, very powerful thing. And I don't have the impression that Bohm was necessarily like that. I feel like probably, you know, he was a man who was like all the rest of us, most of the rest of us, inwardly conflicted and probably not capable of living fully the teaching that he was so interested in and that he expressed so well. Bohm had such a great facility for expressing some of these psychological insights, but as for really truly living them completely, my impression is that he was not able to.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. We have a question coming from Kanchan Gogte. Kanchan, would you please unmute yourself? Kanchan, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, I would unmute myself. My
Yeah.
question, first that I had said that was that the one word was used that Rajgopal's influence on Krishnamurti. So I just wanted to ask, can it be worded like Rajgopal's influence on Krishnamurti? Was there something impact kind of a thing? That is one question. And secondly, I just wanted to ask that David ji has many times referred to it that Krishnamurti's teachings are not as much, are far reaching, but it has not happened. So do you think that it is a difficulty in locating Krishnamurti in typical schools that we are all conditioned towards?
I couldn't quite hear all of that. I heard about 2/3 of it, but parts of the audio were kind of fading in and out, and I wasn't able to really entirely understand the questions. I'm sorry.
And can ask your question one more time and ask one by one. Let him answer first and then go to the second one.
Okay, my first question is that while speaking, one word was used that Rajgopal's influence on Krishnamurti. So I would particularly like to know, was there something like influence kind of a thing on Krishnaji?
I don't think so. Rajagopal was a very different kind of person, and he was. I think, you know, as far as we're able to tell, you know, Rajagopal was very much in charge of all of the business and administrative side of the work, you know, in terms of arranging the talks and arranging the publication. And as far as we can tell, he was a dominating personality, and he dominated Krishnaji. was a kind of bullying person, very meticulous, very demanding. The evidence seems to be that Krishnaji allowed himself to be bullied and dominated in that manner with respect to administrative things. But with respect to the teachings, no. Rajgopal and Krishnji, they didn't talk about the teachings. Rajgopal didn't express that kind of interest or conduct dialogues with him. And there's no evidence that I'm aware of that Rajgopal influenced in any way the development or really the expression of the teachings.
Yes, Kanchan, go ahead, ask your second question.
Can I say something at this point about?
Yes, yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, because you had used that word, yeah.
Yes. Krishnaji was influenced by people in this way, not in his teachings. And his own saying is that he never wavered from his teachings, they were his entirely. So one way was, but as far as his actions in the world, for example, in setting up schools and so on, he relied upon the people who were around him to know what was happening, and so they acted as a filter between, for this is true for all of us. How do we know that anything is happening? It comes to us through various people. And so in the way that they presented it to him, that influenced his decisions about places and people, like where he might want to have a school or where, so in that sense, he was ordinarily, I may say, influenced by people. And I mean, I've observed this happening myself. And the other, of course, was, as I said before, that his teachings were, so what we received of his teachings, the early teachings, let's call it early Krishnamurti. You have to see early Krishnamurti as we know it, because we only know about that through what we read, through reports. That was influenced by, so our knowledge of Krishnamurti was influenced by Rajgopal, not so much him himself. And so, so there is a kind of influence that he exerted, as you say, a kind of dominance even, he was a dominant kind of person, yeah.
Yes, continue. Second question, please.
Yes, second question, David ji, that you have reiterated that Krishnamurti's teachings remain underappreciated. So does this happen because generally people have a tendency in locating any spiritual gurus or philosophers into some schools like Buddhist, Indian, Western, or whatever, but that does not happen with Krishnamurti. So is it because of that that Krishnamurti's teaching remain underappreciated so far? What do you feel?
I think it's a very complex question why Krishnamurti's work is not more widely appreciated. Again, I think it may be somewhat different in the United States as opposed to India or parts of Europe. Um, part of it, I think part of the difficulty is just that Krishnji is utterly original. That you can't, he doesn't really fall in any category. I don't think people know what to do with something that is so comprehensive and original. He says so many things which are, just really different than the way most people think. By being against all kinds of organized religion, or earlier I was talking about the issue of psychological time. That's related to psychological time is related to the whole movement of what you might call self-improvement or wanting to become something more or better inwardly. And that movement of wanting to improve myself psychologically is so deeply ingrained, at least in this country. It's just absolutely taken for granted that everyone wants to do that. And of course, people want to do that. And so to turn around and pinpoint that as one of the essential problems or difficulties or confusions psychologically is just very radically different than the way most people ordinarily think and live. So I think there are many reasons why his work is not more widely appreciated. In the United States, the name itself, Krishnamurti, forms a block. It's just, too many people would just dismiss it and say, well, I'm not interested. The fact that he had no academic credentials, he didn't speak from a platform of having a degree or a university position. And there are many factors that contribute. And also part of it is that I just don't know. I can't understand why he's not more widely. He ought to be, but he just isn't.
Thank you, David. I think we have a question coming from Dinesh ji. Will you please go ahead and ask?
Yes, sir. Mr. Moody, I would like to ask you a question. Whatever you have described, the conflicts, the turbulence, and the disturbances and the conflicts between the various people at that time. So why Krishnamurti's presence have not, if not transformed them, have made any change in them, and why the things were not simplified despite of his presence? Why the teachings have not influenced the other persons who were in conflict, or whatever the disturbance or turbulence or turmoil was taking place at that time? What is your personal feeling, sir?
Well, at the end of his life, Krishnji, made this famous statement 11 days before he died. And he said that no one had fully understood what he was trying to convey. So it wasn't just the teachers or any particular group of people. Krishnji said that he said that no one had lived the teachings, he said. And, I think this was something that was general. It occurred all through his life and with everybody he contacted. There was Krishnji conducted a series of meetings with the trustees of the Krishnamurti Foundation in, I can't remember what year it was. It might have been 1978 or something like that. And some of those dialogues were recorded and published. I think it's called The Perfume of the Teachings. And he's talking to the trustees of the KFA and he's saying, look, he says, I'm not going to be around forever. He says, when I'm gone, people are going to want to come here and meet you, the trustees, and they're going to say, what did you learn from this man? What was it like being around him, and help me understand his teachings? And he challenged the trustees, are you going to be able to answer that man? Krishnji constructed this hypothetical of such an individual. He called him the man from Seattle. How will you answer the man from Seattle when he comes and says, what did Krishnamurti have to say? And the trustees couldn't do it. Even in those dialogues with Krishnji, it was apparent that none of them felt able to take on that challenge. So the transmission or the intelligibility of the teachings is it occurred with all over the place with most of the people that he came into contact with, and again, it has to do, I think, with the fact that the teachings are vast, they're comprehensive, they're very original, utterly original, and very, very different than the way most of us are conditioned to think.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
We can go to, I think,
Can I
Clemens.
add something at this point, which I think is quite interesting?
Please go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Please.
Yes.
Go ahead.
In the last year before he died, Krishnaji spoke to some people about what would happen after his death, how to continue what he had started beyond his death. And he was very clear, there was not going to be one person, nobody to take on the mantle of Krishnamurti, nobody who would embody or personify that intelligence, that worked through him. But he said that it was possible for a group of people, through their inquiry, through their passion and devotion to the central question, which he was very clear about, is the transformation of the consciousness of humanity. That is what he was setting out to do. And that was the thing that needed to be carried forward, this transformation of the consciousness of humanity. And that a group of people, they could, between them, not as individuals, but between them, hold that quality somehow as an atmosphere, as something subtle, which was nothing to do with any one of them, but which other people could encounter, that other people, because the central part of the teachings is not the words, it's not all the talk about mind and brain, and there is something more that goes beyond thought. And whether that is communicated to people, that's what Krishnamurti was trying to do all the time. And so we shouldn't say too quickly that nothing remains. We shouldn't look at individuals, look at, say, David or me. Both of us had a lot of contact with Krishnamurti. You could take a look at us and say, hey, you haven't changed that much. So, but somehow, question is this quality continuing to exist in the world and somehow being manifested or transmitted, or so that's an open question. That's for you to discover. It's not that anybody can say. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Arji. I think very rightly said. We can take two more questions because David goes to bed a little early. So can I request Clemis and then Hansa to ask their questions? Clemis, please go ahead. Clemis.
Yeah. So my question is, I saw the panels, just a minute. I saw the panels where you took part in this infinite potential, and it was quite interesting. And the one that I saw, I realized that you became even uncomfortable because people were twisting quite a lot of what Krishnamurti said or what his teachings are supposed to convey and all this. And my question is, do you feel, but there is an interesting thing because that panel itself, it has more than 2,000 people watching it. So I felt that was quite a lot of interest in it. And so my question is, do you feel that this infinite potential has a potential of spreading or kind of made Krishnamurti's teaching more known, or is it a danger that it will be twisted? Because I have seen a little bit of, I got a bit worried about the way people see those teachings in some of the people who participate in that. So that's my question.
Well, yeah, that film, is such an interesting film, and the film has definitely brought a lot of attention. First of all, obviously to Bohm, but then, secondarily to Krishnamurti's work. I feel that, it's beneficial, it's positive. I think the film does a reasonably good job of presenting Bohm's outlook. Um, the film tries to emphasize, his work in science and cosmology, and it tries to draw out the psychological implications of that to some extent. And Krishnamurti is it's one segment. It's 14 or 15 minutes out of a film which runs about 70 minutes. So it's kind of boxed. The Krishnamurti part is kind of boxed off from the rest in a way, which is a little bit unfortunate. But on the whole, I think that it's a good film, very worthwhile, and I'm really glad that it was made, and I think it has brought attention. I think that again, I'm speaking from the perspective of the United States. Bohm's work is of greater interest to people in this country, I think, than Krishnamurti's work. It's easier in this country for someone to be interested in someone who's a theoretical physicist whose work has larger implications. It's easier, for a wider circle of people to take an interest in that than in something which is, conventionally considered something spiritual. But obviously there's a lot of overlap between Krishnamurti and Bohm, and I think that it spills over from one to the other.
Thank you, David.
I'm sorry I keep asking this, but I knew David very well, David Bohm, that is. And I feel I should say something about this. I'm a physicist too. I studied Bohm at university before I ever met him, before I came to England, before I joined Brockwood Park. So actually, and I studied the field that Bohm was interested in. So I could actually I did discuss all his scientific work with him as well. And I do understand his scientific theories. But it was very clear to me that the center of his life was the teachings.
Yeah.
And that he recognized, I mean, he says sometimes, the human mind has gone the wrong way, that it has given too much emphasis to thought, which doesn't mean that thought isn't absolutely necessary.
Of course.
And but in his life, he had recognized that the emphasis was not on his scientific studies, though he was brilliant. I don't know if this is generally known, but he was being considered for the Nobel Prize when he died. And there was a reasonable expectation that he would get it.
Yeah.
But they don't give the Nobel Prize to people after they die. So the moment he died, there was no chance of him getting it. But his work in science is absolutely first rate. And therefore, a lot of people like Pete, I knew David Pete as well, all these Davids and David Schoenberg, a lot of Davids in there. And so obviously he was more interested in the scientific aspect of it, and he kind of didn't really fully understand why David was Bohm, that is. Sorry, I knew them by the first name, so I call them that. Bohm focused so much on Krishnamurti. He didn't. Neither did his wife. Neither did David Bohm's wife, who was always trying to say to him, you're a famous scientist. Why don't you capitalize on that? Why don't you spend more time on that? She was always pushing him to talk and on. So, but his core interest was not on pushing himself or pushing the self. It was towards the diminution of the self rather than the aggrandizement of the self. So he was kind of in conflict with David Pete. And I mean, I knew his wife very well and kept in touch with her until she died. So, there was always this tension there. But David was definitely focused on the inner more than he was focused on the outer.
I agree.
Thank you, Harshji. I think very well said. We take the last question from Hansa. Please unmute yourself. Yes, ask your question. Please ask your question. Unmute. Yes.
Hello, sir.
Yes. Please go ahead.
David sir, I want to know what are your feeling about his teaching? What you feel J. Krishnamurti wants to teach all of us, and what is the aura of Jai Krishnamurti you feel? What is your personal opinion?
About the core, you say about the core of his teaching? Is that
I
what
think she wants to know what you feel is the most important part of his teachings.
Well, okay, so you know, Harsh was saying just a minute ago that the essence of it is transformation of consciousness of humanity, and you know, I think I would agree with that in general. But you have to know what he means by that. Transformation of consciousness for Krishnamurti has a great deal to do with understanding what is the nature of thought, what is the nature of the thinking process, and the thinking process in Krishnamurti's view has led to a lot of very deep-seated illusions and misunderstandings. It has led, I referred a minute ago to the question of wanting to become something more or better. This is a very pervasive part of most of our lives. And Krishnamurti says that's based on an illusion. And even the notion that we have, you know, a separate psychological self is illusory, he said. So, but you can't understand that unless you understand the nature of thought itself and the thinking process. So I think Krishnamurti's work was designed to draw attention to the nature of thought, of the process of thinking, and the kind of illusions that it gives rise to. But underneath all of that was, you know, just a sense of deep seriousness and taking seriously the possibility for you know, living a life which is deeply beautiful and harmonious. And so there's a religious impulse, I'm trying to say, underneath the very important psychological work, which has to occupy more of our attention.
Thank you, David. Thank you. We come to the close of the session now. There will be some announcement by Sushil ji. But let me thank you, David, once again. We are really, really grateful that you could spare your time and you have been with us. And maybe we'll request you once again, sometimes in April or May, depending on what time suits you, to talk to us again.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed it. The questions were marvelous, and I would love to join you again anytime we can arrange it.
Thank you. Thank you. Sushil ji, would you like to make an announcement? Yeah.
No, sir. Thanks. Please make announcement yourself, please.
Next Sunday, we'll have Chaitanya Nagar. Since I'll be traveling, moving out of Rajghat, so Chaitanya will introduce himself and say something. We'll send you the theme of his talk. And from next Sunday, the timing will be 11 a.m., not 9:30. We made it 9:30 to accommodate David and Mark Lee. So next week onwards, it will be 11 a.m. till we make another announcement, the change of timing. And thank you all. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Dubey. Thank you, Dubey, sir. Thanks to all participants.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. David.
And very nice to connect with you again, David. Yeah.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Harsh.
Please close. Please close.